Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad. Tehami. The National Assembly in Pakistan approved the budget for the next fiscal year 2023 and 24 with some sort of revisions to meet the International Monetary Fund's conditions. The changes include 215 billion rupees additional tax measures, spending cut of 85 billion rupees and lifting of import restrictions. Also 16 billion rupees hike in Benazir income support program allocations. Also powers to increase the petroleum levy from 50 rupees to 60 rupees per litre. Now, we have seen Pakistani authorities repeatedly saying that they are committed to complete the ongoing stalled IMF bailout program. The authorities have been taking tough measures in order to meet the conditions of the IMF. Now, we have also seen Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif having a number of interactions with the IMF chief, Kristalina Georgieva. As the expiry of this bailout program is pretty much around the corner, after the government has fulfilled almost all the prior conditions set by IMF, what are the hopes of the revival of this particular bailout program and the release of the tranche of $1.1 billion after the 9th review of this extended fund facility? Also, in other developments, we have seen that Pakistan's stock exchange surged over 1,000 points today. The KSE 100 index gained over 1,370 points during today's trading. In another major development, the State Bank of Pakistan has increased the policy rate by 100 basis points to 22%. The hopes regarding the revival of the IMF program and these economic developments. To understand all that, we are honored to be joined in the studio by Mr. Ali Salman. He is Executive Director, Policy Research Institute of Market Economy. Mr. Salman, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
We are also honored to be joined at the same time on Skype by Dr. Aqdas Afzal. He is Senior Economist. Dr. Aqdas Afzal, thank you very much for your time also being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Ali Salman. Let's begin with the surge in shares today. What core reasons do you think are associated? Quite a phenomenal one. KSE 100 index gaining 1,370 points.
Well, I think the key, the reason behind is this confidence in the markets that Pakistan is finally inching closer to strike a deal with IMF and getting a staff level agreement, which has been pending for last several months. The major factor is the expectation of stability. I think that is where the investors are always looking at. And if the government keeps changing policies, for instance, trade policies or fiscal policies, taxation policies, then that gives the signals to the investors to actually stay away from the market. And although we have not seen any significant reductions in the super tax, but still the stock exchange indication that market is responding positively to the news of an IMF deal. Now, an IMF deal in terms of the dollar value is important, but I think what is even more important is the fact that when we finally get into that process, it can unlock for us other arrangements, bilateral arrangements and other in the future.
What about this surge in the stock exchange today? The one thing that you've just mentioned is the hope of the revival of this stalled program. Has it anything to do with the lifting of the import restrictions also?
It is very important. I think you have raised a very important point. For last 1 year, this single measure had affected the business environment very negatively. And it also has actually led to the higher inflation. So when businesses which are industries are based and primarily driven by imports, and if they have faced restrictions on the imports in the past, certainly lifting of the imports is a good decision. And this is counterintuitive. Sometimes people think that to control the current account deficit, this policy was adopted. But I think we have actually sacrificed growth at the cost of maintaining the current account. So finally, a good decision, finally a positive decision has been made by the government to lift the import restrictions, and we hope that we stick on that path. Plus, there should not be any meddling with the forex exchange market. I think that goes along with the restrictions on the import. These two measures were harming the economic policy, and finally, I think the sense has prevailed.
I'll be taking your detailed view on regarding the impact of removing the import restriction. Let's talk to Mr. Aqdas Afzal. Dr. Aqdas Afzal, what core reasons do you associate with the surge today in the Pakistan Stock Exchange? Is it the hope of the revival of the stalled IMF program and also the removal of the import restrictions?
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I think where I agree partially with what Mr. Ali Salman has told you in his analysis, I would also add that I think the markets are finally pricing in how Pakistan's political crisis now seems to be abating. I want to remind your audience that the last 1 year and a few months has been a time of extremely volatile political conditions, political uncertainty, and markets have been reflecting that. I mean, that has basically been it has been reflected in the overall business confidence or confidence about the economy. And as Pakistan's political crisis is now abating, and hopefully we are now moving towards general elections, at least it seems to me that the political system is now moving towards general elections. I think markets are pricing that in, as well as the positive news about this breakthrough that has been reached with the IMF at almost at the 9th hour, which is now very welcome. And I think both of these things are being priced in by the market. And because of this, we saw this rally today of 1,371 points. Now, there might be a slight damper on this rally tomorrow because the policy rate has been increased by 1 percentage points, which I believe is in order to I don't want to use the word please the IMF, but one of their requirements in order to successfully complete the 9th review. So I think that might be a slight damper in the rally. But overall, I think the overall confidence in the economy is now increasing, especially at the heels of the political crisis that seems to be abating. And I think if Pakistan now moves forward, we announce the elections and the economy starts becoming more stable, you will see positive changes in the economy, especially, at least I would like to see some gains against the US dollar. But then I would also like to reiterate what Mr. Ali Salman said, that I definitely agree with him that the determination of the exchange rate should be left to the market, because, when we tried to tinker with the exchange rate previously, the results were less than optimal.
Dr. Aqdas Afzal, there was already a price cap which was removed later on by the government.
That's right. So initially there was a price cap, and because of the requirements imposed on the Ministry of Finance, it was let go finally. But I think by that time there has been some loss of trust between the two sides, and I think in hindsight, I think this was unnecessary. But then, as they say in the English language, hindsight is always 20/20. The on-ground realities were different in January and February, but at least right now, it definitely appears that it was unnecessary.
Right, Dr. Aqdas Afzal, as we have seen, the government had been reiterating its stance that it is committed to complete this IMF program. It had been meeting very tough prior conditions by the IMF. This particular budget has also been revised. Certain changes have been made into this one also. And you've already mentioned that political crisis in the country is also abating. So the hopes are quite high for the revival of this program, aren't they?
Yes, I think I would say that I think the probability of Pakistan reaching a breakthrough on the 9th review is very, very high, inshallah. And I think that, but I would also like to tell the audience that, this is a time when we have to be very careful about which way we want to take Pakistan's economy, in which direction do we want to take Pakistan's economy. Because it could be that, the government now becomes relaxed and they start, spending in order to, because the elections are approaching. I think that would be a very bad approach. I think we now have to build on this breakthrough that has been achieved with the IMF. And I think I would really expect that whichever caretaker setup comes in, they keep working on the reforms agenda in Pakistan, privatization in particular, and privatization and some of the other reforms, for example, improving Pakistan's public finances, um, changing the overall tax structure in the direction of making it more progressive. So I think that's something that I think the caretaker government should be working on, and this is why I think it might be a good idea. It might be a good idea to bring in professional people who have done this kind of thing in the past, and then once the new government comes in after the elections with a mandate, then they can continue that reforms process and probably talk with the IMF for another extended fund facility.
So Dr. Aqdas Afzal, we don't see any further reason for IMF to continue with its stance that we have seen over the past 8 months since this particular program of the extended fund facility has been stalled.
Well, the IMF had certain concerns about Pakistan's economy, and then there was a process in which there was a meeting of the minds. There was some delay, of course, but I think both sides seem to have worked out their differences. There's a meeting of the minds now, and I'm very hopeful. Actually, just like I said, I think the probability of this breakthrough is now very, very high.
Right, Mr. Ali Salman, Dr. Aqdas Afzal has mentioned one very important point, as you already mentioned, that the revival of the IMF program as well as the removal of the import restrictions is added to it that political crisis is also abating in the country, and that has also led to the positive sentiment. What's your take?
No, I think these are points certainly agreeable. I would just like to caution on one particular comment, and that is the role of the caretaker government and the expectation that the professional and the technocratic government should be in place to carry on reforms. While we certainly should hope that whatever new government or caretaker government comes in, it should not reverse any reforms. But I would not like to pin hopes in terms of this technocratic government or reforms with any caretaker government. The caretaker job should be to actually oversee the elections that are being held impartially and efficiently and peacefully in the country, and hand over to a government which comes with a fresh mandate for 5 years, because that has been the key missing link in last 1.5 years, as we have seen. Multiple finance ministers have come and gone, the governments have changed, and that has really disturbed the market sentiment, the investment, and also the deal, the discussion with the IMF. So to be fair, I mean, the current government, and after a lot of reluctance, has finally adopted all the conditions for the IMF. So I do not expect that we will need to go significantly down.
So they have been finally met. It were tough. These were tough conditions, and the government authorities have been saying that we took some tough decisions at the cost of our political capital also. So after the government has left no stone unturned in meeting those all prior actions set by the IMF, so we don't see any reason that this particular program in next couple of days shouldn't be revived.
Yes, I mean, in the last few months, a few weeks rather, we have also seen some comments from IMF headquarters commenting on the political situation in the country, which were not welcomed by the government because they were not directly related with the economic policies. There are those signals which come sometimes and sort of distort the overall trust environment from both sides. So I hope that nothing of that comes up. And also remember, just 2 months ago, IMF has strongly indicated its desire that other countries, friendly countries, should submit a letter of support or letter of commitment to the IMF, to the government, that it will help Pakistan in meeting the shortfall in the current account deficit.
That was done by China and Saudi Arabia.
So eventually it was done, especially with China rolling over that. But I don't think that a formal letter as such were procured. So I'm happy to see that IMF is no more insisting on those sort of conditions which were not part of the original program. But I'm just cautioning that some of these signals do come from the IMF. So we hope that government remains committed to the constitution, to the program, and to general economic stability. And by the way, when we always refer to the IMF as like superimposing conditions on us, we need to change that narrative, and we need to think what is a sound economic policy for us.
So what was the point of talking about the political situation in the country?
That's what I mean. That was uncalled for on behalf of IMF. This comment was not needed and was not part of the discussions, but it was still made to maybe use as a pressure point to exert on the government. I think that pressure was sustained, and the government responded very well to that pressure. And the focus should be back on the sound economic policies, which, as we've seen through the budget, the final budget which was passed, we have seen those conditions or those suggestions have been largely incorporated.
Right, Dr. Aqdas Afzal, if this program is revived in the next couple of days before the program expires, what are going to be the benefits for Pakistan's overall economy in the very immediate term?
I first want to respond to what was discussed here, and I would like to agree with Mr. Ali Salman. I think I would just like to remind the audience that this is not the IMF's mandate to be commenting about a country's political situation. So I think those comments were definitely done, in how should I say, leaving out what the IMF is mandated to do vis-a-vis a country's economy. And I think the kind of response that they garnered from the Pakistani government was appropriate. So I think this whole episode of Pakistan and IMF, taking so long since, this ninth review was supposed to be finished in November of last year. The whole episode of the ninth review taking so long, I think this requires introspection, both at the side of the Pakistani government as well as at the side of the IMF, because it was not just Pakistan that was waiting and waiting and waiting to hear from the IMF. There were other countries like Zambia, like Ghana, Sri Lanka, and I'm happy to tell you that all these countries have now also heard positive news from the IMF. So I think when we talk about Pakistan and IMF relations, there are certain things that need to be done at the level of the Pakistani government. But then the IMF as an institution is also evolving. And there are certain things that they are doing really well, and there are certain things they're not doing so well. And it's not just me who is talking about this. You can read about this in leading journals like the Economist magazine. Now, to answer the next point that was raised here about having whether the IMF was given the letter by Pakistani government in which certain friendly countries are promising funds. I think one reason why this deal is now taking place has to do with the 3 consecutive months of current account surplus that have been generated by the Pakistani economy. And the current account deficit for the entire year is going to come at about $4 billion, which is a phenomenal reduction compared to last year of about $18 billion. And initially, the IMF had penciled in a current account deficit of $7 billion. But when they now realize that Pakistan's economy is going to end the fiscal year with a current account deficit of $4 billion, I think that might have tipped the scales in Pakistan's favor. So I think these 2 things are very important to also put on the table for the audience. Now, to come back to the question that you asked me, how is this going to impact Pakistan's economy? It is going to impact Pakistan's economy positively. And recently there has been talk of whether Pakistan is going to default or not. I think such talk can now be completely dismissed for the foreseeable future, because I don't think there is any legitimate probability of even discussing that scenario. And finally, I would like to say that Ali Saab has made a very fair point, and I stand corrected about the basic function of the caretaker government. I was only proposing a caretaker setup comprising professionals so that they could probably create some kind of a roadmap not that they actually implement reforms, because that is obviously something that the democratically elected government with mandate should do. But they shouldn't be just wasting their time in, okay, so conducting elections is a very serious job. They should definitely do that. But if they can, find some people who can use this time effectively, maybe the new government or the government that comes after elections can hit the ground running.
Right. Mr. Ali Salman, the benefit or impact on Pakistan's economy after once this particular program is revived in the immediate term?
Well, in the immediate term, we will certainly have, in terms of the cash flow, Pakistan, of course, is still facing the current account deficit, although as Dr. Aqdas rightly mentioned that government has significantly improved or reduced the current account deficit, and I also mentioned this in my article today. That improvement of 75% is significant. So a dollar inflow would certainly help plug the gap a bit more. But more importantly, this will have two kind of impact in my opinion. One is that in next year Pakistan has made certain projections in terms of inflows of dollars through grant, aid, loans. And when an IMF program is signed, then this gives some level of stability and confidence to other bilateral institutions and countries that the government is following certain principles. So that will happen, and I'm hoping that also it will open up opportunities for Pakistan for commercial markets, because we should not be just looking at the government as sources of debt, but also Pakistan should be looking at the commercial market. And last 1 year, unfortunately, if you look at the bond market, Pakistan has significant losses in the risk profile of in our international debt has declined significantly, and the risk has improved. So that needs to be reduced. And so this, with the IMF dealing coming in, we will have more investment opportunities. We'll have lesser of a cash flow problem, and probably more business confidence will come through.
More investment, you think, would be coming after this particular program would be revived. So, what sort of impact do you think this import restriction has?
You see what IMF is suggesting. Let's talk about import restrictions. Let's talk about the business regulations. Let's talk about the tax environment, tax reforms environment. Although IMF program is not suggesting any drastic tax reforms, and we as in a think tank has been calling for a broad base and low rate taxation structure. That is not something which IMF is buying, because we have not seen reduction in the tax rate. We have actually seen increase in the tax rate. Certainly in the last phase of the budget and the changes, we have seen that some income brackets would be exposed to higher taxation rates. So in that scenario, the general environment of the business, when they experience more stability, that's certainly a good sign. But I'm saying that we need to look beyond the IMF program also, and that will only trigger the source of wealth and source of investment for Pakistan.
Right. We're joined by another participant in the show. Dr. Abdul Qayyum Suleri is Executive Director at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Dr. Abid, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. Now, since the government has revised this upcoming fiscal year's budget to meet the IMF requirements, how hopeful are you that the stalled IMF bailout program would be revived after this?
A few hours ago, the increase in interest rate, I think that was also one of the requirements. So now State Bank has already issued the circular taking off the restrictions on imports. The budget numbers are revived. Some of the controversial steps like amnesty scheme for bringing $100,000 per annum without any question, those have been already addressed. And with this interest rate increase, I think that now the next step is perhaps one or two last meetings between Finance Minister and IMF mission, so that SLA can be signed. After signing of SLA, either IMF can also convene the board meeting and Pakistan's case can be discussed there. At least a ninth review tranche, $1.2 billion debt can be released. And if that's not possible, then at least after signing of staff level agreement, Pakistan's case can be discussed in next board meeting. So this deadline of 30th June, that after 30th June the program would come to an end. That would no more remain a threat if we can sign staff level agreement before 30th June.
So, Dr. Abid, once the staff level agreement after the ninth review is signed, so is it going to for the release of the tranche of 1.2 or 1.1 billion dollars that is associated with the ninth review, or is there anything further that we can see?
As I said, that after the staff level agreement, the next step is board of director meeting, and once that meeting is convened, the board will be approving the tranche for Pakistan, $1.2 billion. It will not be more than $1.2 billion, but it has to be approved by board after signing the staff level agreement, and that's what we need to now wait and see how long it takes for signing
Right,
of SLA.
right. Dr. Abid, the government has also removed the import restrictions. How do you see this step? What sort of an impact it's going to have on Pakistan's economy in order to spur the economic growth in particular?
You see, it's a catch-22 situation. Of course, government never imposed this restriction willingly. It was the shortage of dollars, balance of payment crisis that led government to adopt to this sphere measure. Now, of course, it's easy lifting all restrictions, but if incoming dollars inflow, that doesn't get revived and that doesn't get resumed, that would lead to a problem. Of course, all the importers, they would like to have dollars. Commercial banks, they would be buying dollars from open market, and that would also be impacting rupees exchange rate. Rupee would lose its value unless and until there are certain assurances that inflow of dollars it would get resumed. And the best assurance at the time is IMF ninth review.
Right, in case if this particular program is not revived, what options do you think are at the hands of Pakistani authorities?
I don't see them any option. Plan A, B, C, D, all of them, they are linked with IMF. The maximum this government can do till 12th of August, until the life of current assemblies, they can keep on getting these rollovers and financial assurances to keep the ball rolling. But in the second quarter of next fiscal year, I mean September 2023 onward, it would be difficult to rely on those rollovers because the amount of debt servicing would be way higher than Pakistan's total reserve, state bank's reserve. And that is a situation that government is trying to avoid now. And that's why it's doing the last-ditch efforts to clinch the deal.
Right, Dr. Abid, one last comment regarding the government came up with the economic revival plan a couple of days before, under which the Special Investment Facilitation Council has been established, which will be giving a single window operation, and it will focus on capitalizing the untapped potential of the key sectors through indigenous development and investment from the friendly countries. What's your understanding of this step?
I think it's a step in the right direction. If one looks at what happened with the MOUs which were signed with the PTI government, most of them, almost all of them couldn't get materialized because of a lack of coordination, because of bureaucratic hurdle, because of procedural delays, because of the fact that some of those MOUs were signed in the areas which was the domain of provincial government, not the federal government, and so on and so forth. While if one looks at some of the positive examples where these issues were actually addressed, it is our NCOC during COVID are part of core cell to get Pakistan graduated from grey list. So some sort of a mechanism where all stakeholders, they are present, they are taking ownership of the decision, they are taking ownership of getting those decisions implemented. That was quite important, and that's where this council, newly established council, that would play its role. Now, the second factor after this, that of course this council on its own cannot take care of all the economic woes of Pakistan, and that's where the second step is, and the second step is talking of some sort of consensus, minimal economic agenda that can be discussed between PMLN, People's Party, and all other major political parties, so that council can get that agenda implemented and things they can resume to normal. Of course, it's a painful process, but this is what we have to go through.
Right. Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, Executive Director at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Thank you very much for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Mr. Ali Salman, and now talking about this IMF program, in case if it is not revived, what are going to be the challenges ahead?
Well, I think those challenges were identified by Dr. Abid. Certainly, I think the biggest challenge would be actually to meet the external payments gap. So far, in last 1 year, I think this is something which Mr. Dar is very proud of, and rightly so, that he has managed the external account without IMF inflows coming in. So he has been giving this signal in the past also that we can carry through by negotiation with friendly countries, and even he signaled a restructuring of the debt at one point. So these options were considered, but I think now the sort of the train has moved on, and now we are looking to the IMF deal really. So this is an hypothetical question, but these conditions, these situations or assumptions were considered, and debt structuring was an important part of it. So I think that is normally what countries would opt to. Although then the debate really starts with debt structuring. If you're saying that reschedule of payments and not just rollovers, then effectively it is default. Although we are not going for declare the default. So in that sense, debt structuring can be considered in some way an orderly default versus a disorderly default, and that is something which I think Pakistan government considered, and that may be an option if this deal was not happening. Although probably we are going to converge, sign that deal very soon. Secondly,
so that's going to release only the tranche of $1.1 billion.
That's right. I mean, if the SLA
review
goes ahead and the board also approves, then yes, so we will get that $1.2 billion maximum. So that was, but your question was, what if this does not happen? How are we going to meet the external loan payment? So I was referring to debt structuring, rescheduling, rollover as the option. But I'd like to briefly comment on one important thing, and we keep coming back to this import restriction. I'd like to clarify that as an economist, I think it is our responsibility to explain to the viewers that this idea that somehow dollars are short and we need to control it is a deeply flawed idea. And this is the idea which has actually led into restricting imports. Once Pakistani economy is 90%, the exports or industries are driven by 90% of imports. Once you stop it, once you stop the flow, it is very difficult to kick-start the economy in the same manner. So we had a considerable
reduction in the current account deficit.
I know. So the current account deficit were achieved, but what was happening, if you look at the overall the flow, then there was a significant reduction in the exports proceeds. There were reduction in the remittance flow in last 6 months or so. So if you look at the fact that yes, we were able to save significant and reduce this current account deficit, but at the same time we were also losing on growth, we were losing on exports, we were losing on remittance. So just looking at backwards, I would definitely maintain this position that import restrictions was never a good idea, and coupled with the meddling of the foreign exchange market made the situation worse for our overall economic management, and we should never try it again.
Right, Dr. Aqdas Afzal, so if in case this particular program is not revived, what are going to be the challenges for Pakistan? And also, please shed some light regarding what would it depict about the role of IMF?
Okay, I think the first thing that I want to talk about right now is the trade theory that Mr. Ali Salman has presented. And, since I am also an economist, I would like to very respectfully beg to differ with Mr. Ali Salman. What Mr. Ali Salman has described is one viewpoint on how economies should be managed, which is the idea of free trade. I mean, the idea of free trade basically came around, it developed gradually, but then it really, became dominant idea or ideology with the advent of the Washington Consensus in 1989, 1990, after the implosion of the Soviet Union. And free trade worked really well for a lot of countries until the rise of China. And now with the rise of China, even countries where the very idea of free trade originated, that is the United States of America, they are now going beyond the idea of Washington Consensus, and they are now talking about imposing restrictions on trade vis-a-vis countries like China. And they are now talking about industrial policy, which are ideas which were completely alien to the intellectuals who had come up with this idea of free trade. I mean, free trade is a great idea. It works really well, but between countries which are at the same level of technological innovation. I mean, no person here talks about being at the same level of technological innovation. If Pakistan and China keep doing free trade, it's very unlikely that any time in the next 50 years, Pakistan is going to reach any kind of a trade balance with China. So I think this idea of free trade is very important, but now the world has really moved on from this idea of free trade to this idea of being very strategic in your economic interests. And we see that happening in the rest of the world. I mean, look at the kind of restrictions that are being placed by the United States on China when it comes to importing components for silicon chips. So I think we need to qualify when we talk about free trade. And I think if Mr. Dar had not imposed the kind of controls that he imposed on imports, I think Pakistan would have already defaulted right now. So I think in all honesty, we have to give credit to, this policy of trying to trying to prevent this collapse coming from the external side. Free trade has its merits, but only when it takes place between countries that are at the same level of technological innovation. I mean, look at the example of India. People keep talking about Indian reforms of 1991, but they forget that before 1991, India was a closed economy, and they worked really hard in developing their indigenous capabilities, developing the IIT infrastructure, developing Tata, Infosys, what have you. And then once they were ready, they opened up to the rest of the world, and the rest is history. So I think we need to qualify, especially these days when countries like the US, which was really the place where Washington Consensus originated, they're now moving away from Washington Consensus towards industrial policy. And now to answer your question about the IMF, look, I would not want to dwell on, what would happen in case IMF did not sign on the dotted line with Pakistan. I think this is an exercise in counterfactuals. It is a very difficult exercise. I think we will cross that bridge when we get to that bridge. But I think whatever has happened thus far, it seems extremely encouraging. I think Pakistan seems to be coming out from one of the worst crises in its history, especially since 1971. And I'm looking forward to better economic days ahead.
Right, Mr. Ali Salman, do you want to add anything regarding this particular comment, the view given by Dr. Aqdas?
Yeah, I think that,
quite in detail.
I really appreciate that, and the two economists should always disagree for the discussion. But briefly, yes, there are problems with the free trade. There are challenges. And if US is imposing trade restrictions on China, it is doing wrong. US policy is not a benchmark of trade
But there is a
policy.
very important point he has already raised, that free trade actually happens to be suitable between the countries of same technological innovation.
Well, this is, in my humble opinion, this is a fallacy. Because you do trade.
I'll have to go back to Dr. Aqdas Afzal after you.
Because you do trade, let's say, take example of India, China, and other countries. So do you think that China has become the industrial power of the world after attaining the same level of technological innovation vis-a-vis Germany or US? No. In terms of technological innovation, patents, IP, copyrights, US, Germany is far ahead than China even now. But China was able to offer a comparative advantage on mass scale standardized production of goods according to designs produced in, let's say, in R&D labs in US. And that is how the trade functions. Trade is a mutual process. And trade only happens when two parties see gains coming out of it. So this notion of whether the two countries should achieve similar level of technology, that actually goes against the very ideal level of trade.
Should I go to Dr. Aqdas Afzal to take his view on this particular? Dr. Aqdas Afzal, your quick comment regarding this.
Sure, I think I wouldn't use the word fallacy. I mean, like I said, there are different viewpoints out there on how two countries should trade. And as far as the example of India is concerned, look, India has developed a competitive advantage in services. So if you develop a competitive advantage in something, be it agriculture, services, or industrial manufacturing, I mean, then you can trade freely from the rest of the world. But if you're a country like Pakistan, which doesn't have a comparative advantage or a competitive edge in neither agriculture, nor services, nor industrial manufacturing, and then you open up your borders, which we have done since 1990, your rupee is going to go into free fall because of excessive current account deficits. I distinctly remember the year 1990 when, or I think it was 1989, when currency became convertible. $1 was around 25 rupees. When I was studying in the US, $1 was 50 rupees. It is now at 300 rupees. And if we keep going this on this path, it's going to be free fall. So I really think that we need to sit down and think strategically how Pakistan is going to get out of this very unfavorable situation. Probably follow the example of East Asian countries, which, as Mr. Ali Salman knows, used a number of inputs in order to make whatever they were producing competitive and then traded with the rest of the world. It was not just free trade. It was basically using state capacity to first develop a competitive edge or a competitive advantage and then trading with the rest of the world.
Right. Mr. Ali Salman, how would you like to respond to this particular view of comparative edge?
No, I think the competitive advantage is the driving factor for all the trade. So on that, we absolutely agree as economists. But we can always disagree on the historical interpretation of what happened in East Asia, for instance, how Malaysia, where I have lived for some years, used the advantage of high level of education and also stable business environment, a good administration to actually encourage the investors from outside, from US in particular, to develop factories, and then those were produced and exported with a very low level of value addition on which Malaysia still thrived. But allow me to quickly comment on one important theme which you earlier raised. I think this is important and we can talk about free trade in another program. We'll be happy to contribute, and Dr. Aqdas, I'm sure we will enjoy the conversation. But allow me to comment on this idea of this Supreme Council which has recently been formed, SIFC, as you mentioned. Now, I'm a bit concerned on that development. Look, there are already constitutional arrangements in place in Pakistan like CCI, which should work if they are meeting, which should work for the inter-provincial coordination, for instance. A thorny issue is the general sales tax regime, services, which each province is in a different kind of regime, causing a lot of disruption for the businesses across the country. That need to be sorted. But we do not need frankly, the army chief to tell their provincial
But they are
heads
going to they're going to give
how
the
to
support
do
regarding
it.
the management and for the
Yeah.
technical assistance.
But this
and their, role
this
is going to reduce
securitization,
gradually.
that's where I'm coming from. This view that somehow we need a security or strategic view of the economic management is problematic. So this is we have just failed in a politically hybrid experiment, and I hope that we do not see an economic hybrid regime.
Your point is well taken, Mr. Ali Salman, Executive Director at Policy Research Institute of Market Economy. Thank you very much for being with us in the studio today. And Dr. Aqdas Afzal joining us on Skype, Senior Economist. Thank you very much for your time also, Dr. Aqdas Afzal, for being with us on Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.